So, ladies and gentlemen, we spend a lot of time talking about whose fall off needs to be studied, but we also don't spend as much time as we should talking about whose ability to survive and show resiliency needs to be studied. And that leads me to talk about Dababy and what he's been doing the past couple of years. I think it's pretty interesting. So we're gonna dive into that. But before we do, make sure you guys hit the like and subscribe button. So Dababy became really popular in like the late 2010s, early 2020s. He had a bunch of hit songs like Rockstar and Suge, and he was on the original version of Levitating with Dua Lipa. So he was on fire at one point, had a lot of momentum, also had a lot of charisma, so a lot of people just liked him. And he was in a position to where you would expect him to last longer in the mainstream than he did. But, he said a couple things that rubbed people the wrong way. And so he ended up losing steam within the mainstream. But what ends up happening is, after, like many artists, once you lose that steam, you may have to readjust how you handle business and what some of your expectations are. And many artists, what could end up happening is they may have to change how much they charge for certain services, right? Because when these artists are at their peak, they could charge an insane amount of money for anything, right? Like, I remember when in the early 2010s, when 2 Chainz had first rebranded from Titty Boy to 2 Chainz, and he was on fire. At that point, allegedly, he was charging like $100,000 for a guest feature. Now, is he charging that price to this day? I doubt it. He could be, but I just highly doubt it, because, obviously he lost that steam. It's been like 15 years, obviously, right? But sometimes you could have artists who, they could be too prideful and they don't want to lower their price for what they charge for features or walkthroughs or concert performances. But it seems as though Dababy had enough common sense to recognize that he needed to make that that adjustment. So, because Dababy was talking to Wallo and Gillie from $1 Million Worth of Game, and he ended up mentioning how on average he was making about 300,000 for a concert performance. And he even mentioned how at one point the highest he got paid was $500,000 for a performance. But of course, once the canceling started, he lost that steam and he couldn't still charge that same amount of money. He actually mentioned how people on his team they were more hesitant to want to take lower prices for performances than he was. But this is also why you got to trust your own gut and make sure that you still are able to just make executive decisions when it comes to your life and your career, because he understood that he wasn't in the same position anymore, and yesterday's price isn't always today's price. People usually say that when it's time to charge more, but sometimes that also applies when it's time to charge less. And so now Dababy explains how instead of him making 300,000 for a show, he's only making 30,000 for a show, which is still a lot of money. That's still an insane amount of money to make for a performance. And it's definitely good that he had the common sense to recognize that he had to make that adjustment. And he also understood that 30,000 is still a lot of money. That 30,000 for a show is still a crazy amount of money. You do 20, 30 performances in a year, and you're making an insane amount of money. You're touching like 7 figures just off of performances. So that's very nice to see that he did make that adjustment pretty seamlessly, or like it hasn't seemed like he's been bitter as far as I could tell, but I can't read his mind. But you also see him now putting out more songs, trying to stay afloat. And also, he's been picking up more steam again recently because he released a single about a month or two ago called Pop That Thing. It's a pretty, in my opinion, a pretty dope party song. It kind of feels like hip hop mixed with like some house music, mixed with like some bounce music. I'm not sure if he did that on purpose. I'm assuming he did. Either way, I think it comes out like a dope party song. It's picked up steam, and obviously, if you still make it 30K a show, I mean, you're in a great position, right? Because you got people like Fetty Wap, who he's alleging that he's only charging about 5,000 a show, but they're in different situations, right? Because even though Fetty Wap had a higher peak, Fetty's peak was only for like the year of 2015, whereas Dababy's peak went from like 2018 to like 2021. So it's a different situation. But that's again 30,000 per performance. That's still an insane amount of money. I'm sure all, or at least most, underground artists would definitely be down to perform for that type of payout. Like, you go do a handful of shows every year and you could be in the high six, maybe even seven figures. That's a great position to be in. But let me know, are you surprised that Dababy at his peak was charging that much for performances? And are you surprised that he is still able to charge 30K for performances now?